We'll go ahead and start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pink, Old and Brown Book Club, the Groucho Club's book club. I'm Madlen Davies, for those who haven't been before. And by day, I'm a journalist, but by night, I'm a book lover. So I'm just going to mute everyone just so we can focus on the discussion tonight. We don't have any barking dogs or sort of screaming children, but we want it to be as interactive as possible. So if you have a question or a comment, just put it in the chat, or I will leave some time at the end just so you can ask any questions to Emma directly. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Emma J. Bell, author of 9 Secrets to Thriving, Uncovering Your Inner Resilience. The book is absolutely full of inspiring stories from people who have lived through terrorist attacks, chronic illness, heartbreak, bereavement, disability, and yet still have found ways to thrive and really feel alive. I absolutely loved the mixture of human stories and really concrete practical advice. So welcome, Emma. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
I'm over the moon, Maddie. Thanks for having me. And hello, everyone. Thanks for moving your dinner forward or back to be here. Appreciate it. Or your gin and tonic. Well, I hope some of you have a G&T at the moment.
So in your book, you describe your personal journey. So how you're a corporate lawyer working all the time and really just surviving. And if you've gone through divorce and suffered depression, was that personal journey the starting point for writing this book?
I don't think it was quite the starting point. Now I look back, I think everybody on this call will know that they have had experiences in their childhood that maybe they are subconsciously driven by until something happens in their adult life, and then all those old patterns just come through. And for me, those somethings that happened were, being highly ambitious, getting the partnership really young, hitting the wall of divorce, getting depression, and then realizing that actually these were just me. Those things were caused by me living out a pattern, which definitely demonstrated that I had not really been thriving at any point in my life. So I'd like to say that was the wall, but I think it was really just the sort of Damocles moment that cast a light over the whole of my life. And I think now I'm a coach, I see that that's so true for many of us.
Mm-hmm. And I guess if we're going to talk about thriving, we should probably define it. So what does thriving mean to you?
So I need to, before Maddie and I came on, we were having a little bit of a chat. And the first thing I have to say to you is I'm a reformed lawyer. So I've got a very highly attuned left brain, right? So when I'm embarking on a research project, and we had a whole team on this, including a very eminent psychologist, we needed defined terms. So we have defined terms for resilience and for thriving, which I think are so helpful when we think about thriving. So obviously we've got surviving, which is that you just get through some adversity or trauma. Then we've got this idea of resilience, which is defined as bouncing back. But thriving is so much more than bouncing back. It's about bouncing forward. It's about growing through adversity so that you're forever changed by that adversity in a really positive way, which is why meeting these 50 thrivers was so incredibly life-changing for me and so life-affirming for me.
Mm-hmm. And when you did all this research, did you find there were certain personality traits that were more likely to be thriving? Or how do people even know if they're kind of thriving or not?
Well, do you know, Maddie, I don't think these people really knew as such that they were thriving. But because we had the defined term and we had all of the kind of psychological subsets of thriving, as part of the research for deciding who would make the cut for the 50 thrivers, we were testing their attributes, how they were feeling, how they felt before adversity, how they were feeling after adversity, and so on against their definitions. So, I mean, some of them did self-identify as thrivers, but some of them actually didn't. They just knew, they just called it resilience. They knew that they were way better than they ever thought they would have been. So every single person I met, I interviewed, I asked them, did you consider yourself as being particularly resilient before the adversity struck? And every single one of them said, no way. If somebody had told me that this was going to happen in my life, I would have said there was no way I would get through it. Never mind thrive as a consequence of it. So whilst I went into the research thinking, you know, there must be some psychological traits, some characteristics, some personality type in common among each of the thrivers, what we found in the research was that wasn't borne out at all. In fact, you know, we're all born with a resilient setting we inherit from our parents, which is here in our frontal, you know, left temple. But that's only a tiny part of the story. What we found from the research was that thriving, resilience is a skill that you develop. It's something born out of the choices that we make all day, every day. It's kind of like doing press-ups for the deltoid muscles. You know, if you do one, you're not going to get great deltoid muscles, but if you do repeated press-ups. And so these people didn't have the characteristics in common or personality traits in common, but what they did have in common was this conscious choosing, deciding and acting in a particular way that helped them, enabled them, in fact, to thrive. And they were doing these 9 things consistently that enabled them to thrive. So that for me was, it was a revelation, and it was so positive because I thought, well, that means any of us can thrive. Any of us can thrive. We just need to apply these practices, these strategies, and be a little inspired, if I'm honest, by the thrivers to do that. And that was a big breakthrough, I think, in the research.
And that's what's so amazing about your book, right, isn't it? Was this kind of practical guide to how to be resilient or how to tone those muscles around when you started looking at this?
Yeah, well, the whole point of the book, you know, everything I do, I'll only do it if I really feel I can make a positive difference. So when I set out to take the research and apply it to writing a book, it had to be a practical guide. I mean, the whole point of it was that everyone who listened to the book would be able to start thriving, you know, 10 minutes after they put the book down or they stopped listening. So it's really, really practical. And of course, we have 28 of the thrivers speaking on the book. So, you know, their advice is very practical when they're talking about their own experiences as well. So I'm glad you picked that up. It was intended to be really, really practical.
And in the book, you talk about how doing all these very emotionally charged interviews left you almost with burnout. You became quite tearful in one. So that seemed a really good example of the need to reiterate all of these practices. Can you just talk us through that realization?
So I was in Toronto. I was interviewing Helen Connolly. And Helen's story is that she was having dinner at the Oberoi Hotel in Mumbai with a couple of friends of hers, Alan and his 13-year-old daughter Naomi, when the terrorists broke into the hotel and into the restaurant and started firing at the diners there. And Helen and Alan and Naomi and the other 2 diners at the table crawled under the table under cover. And I'm listening to Helen tell me this story, knowing in fact that at one point in this journey I'm going to meet Kia Sher, who was Alan's wife and Naomi's mother. And Helen told me that when the bullets, the firing stopped, she looked over at Alan and Naomi and realized that they were dead. And she, in fact, was the only survivor from their table. And I'm listening to this. And she was the 7th, I should say, 7th interview on this journey. So I'd been flying hundreds of miles between every interview, listening to interviews like these. And I started crying. Now, what we say in Scotland about the kind of crying I was doing is it was all tears and snotters, right? I mean, it was proper crying. And it was like, I mean, the story was horrific, but it wasn't just her story. It was the previous 6 stories that almost just took me over. And she reached over and took my hand and she said, you know, are you looking after yourself? And I realized that even though I'd suffered depression all those years ago and I'd started meditating and I'd started exercising and doing all of these things that really helped give me a grounding, I hadn't been doing any of these things on this journey. So I'm on this project that we call the Global Resilience Project, and I was anything but resilient. So it was Helen during that interview said to me, Emma, you wouldn't expect your mobile phone to work if you didn't charge it. So don't expect you to work if you don't charge it. And she said, you've got to really take care of yourself. And so from that moment on, between every interview and after every interview, I had a whole process that I went through to kind of absorb what I've heard and then be able to work through it and let it go. Yeah, so it was really ironic that I was anything but resilient at resilient interview number 7, you know, greeting all over Helen's kitchen table. But she was incredible. And of course, these interviews, you're hearing about these dreadful stories, but what I want to make the point is, you know, the book is ultimately inspiring, because then Helen goes on to talk about how she went from that moment under the table in the restaurant at the Oberoi Hotel to where she was in front of me, you know, living this full life, having so much wisdom and insight, and just, you know, being so full of joy and balance. And ultimately, that's what every one of these 50 thrivers left me with, was if they can thrive through those things, then you bet I can thrive through anything that I'm bound to face in my life, and we all can.
Mm-hmm. And I found Helen's story really striking, and that I thought that, you know, someone who'd experienced something like that might be left with PTSD or would be very scared of kind of making human connections again. But she really put that focus on kind of opening her heart up to humanity, and described taking that kind of, was it a kind of a heart balance break? Could you describe what her technique was?
Well, so for Helen, she talked about practicing yoga. She talked about practicing meditation. She talked about being able to sort of be in the pain, so be in a difficult situation, but not be of the pain, so create some sort of distance. But a very closely related thriver, Alan's wife and Naomi's mother, Kia Sher, who I went to interview over in Florida. I mean, she was incredible. So, you know, from her point of view, she's in Florida looking after her mum who was ill. She was meant to have gone on this meditation retreat with Alan and Naomi. And the call came through at Wednesday lunchtime. One of the women on the retreat said, look, the terrorists have taken over the Oberoi Hotel. And Kia told me she fell to her knees. And she spent the next 2 days just trying to get through to understand if Alan and Naomi were okay. And it was on Friday morning that the news came through that they were both dead. And even though I knew the story before I went out to interview her, I'm sitting in this room with her thinking, I don't know if I could survive that, let alone thrive. And even now when I tell her story, I mean, I've told it many, many times, including in the book, I find it so moving. But she talked about the balance break that she took, but there was part of her story that I want to share just now, because I was asking her, well, how do you get from that extent of loss to where you are now, which is psychologically thriving? And she told me a story that in the weeks after losing Alan and Naomi, she'd been asked by the Synchronicity Foundation, who had organised the retreat, to go to a news conference. So she goes into this massive hall. I mean, we all remember, I think, the Mumbai terrorist attack. So it was very newsworthy at the time. And there were hordes of journalists in this hall. And one of the journalists asked her how she could ever forgive the terrorists who had murdered her husband and child. And she said, there's nothing to forgive. They were doing the best they could with the thinking they had at the time. Well, that knocked me sideways, because I'm thinking, how can you have the, I mean, does that mean you condone what they did? And she said, no, Emma, let me explain. She said, absolutely, I didn't condone what they did, but I knew I had to choose the narrative. Because if I didn't consciously choose the narrative, it would choose me, and I would drop into vengeful thinking and want revenge. And she said, my focus at that point was honouring the lives of my husband and daughter. And I knew I had to take control of the story that I was going to fasten on to. And the story was, I genuinely do believe, she said, that these men had been radicalised. And that from that mindset of being radicalised, that's why they took the action that they did. She said, and so I was interested in going to Mumbai, understanding how these young men had become radicalised, meeting other people who'd lost loved ones in the Mumbai terrorist attack. So, you know, I talk a lot about how to build mental resilience, especially during this pandemic. And that's the one of the tips I share is, you know, her ability to choose the narrative that ultimately set her on the thriving trajectory in those circumstances. Well, if that doesn't inspire you to go, you know what, when I get that email from a colleague, you know, where I just have to see the sender profile and he drives me mad, you know, that I don't know if I'm the only one, but, you know, you just go, oh, for God's sake, it's him again. Then you bet we can choose a narrative in the face of that, and we can thrive all day, every day in it. And she and the other 49 thrivers have really helped me thrive through this past year. So, you know, that sort of lovely link between Helen and Kia, they're really the only two thrivers who are linked by story, though they weren't friends and they're not friends. It's just that Helen happened to be with Kia's husband and daughter in the Oberoi Hotel when they passed.
Mm. And that seemed to be a really key point for me. You call it kind of taking control of the narrative, but also sort of taking responsibility for one's own life and happiness. Was that a trait that all of the thrivers shared?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that you can't thrive unless you're prepared to take radical responsibility. But the one thing I learned in that context that many of you, it may have dawned on many of you, and I might be behind the curve on this one, but so many of the thrivers said, look, you do, when something tough happens, you do fall into the victim narrative. You know, you do spend a moment, and it's important to spend a moment going, this hurts, this is difficult. And that whole, that point of accepting and acknowledging your pain and your suffering, and having the support of people who can validate your pain and suffering, necessarily means you have to be in a sort of victim narrative. And that's a really important part of the transition through into resilience. So through surviving into resilience and then into thriving. And honestly, I'd never really thought about it in that way. So that's an important thing that I've learned. And now I coach people who've got terminal cancer, people who've lost husbands to suicide and so on. And that's a very important part of the journey. But I don't think we really see that as prominently in when we look at the grief curve and so on. It certainly is not something I had appreciated as much as I now appreciate. And it's a really fundamental part of this research, of the findings in this research.
Mm-hmm. And how long is that period? Should you allow yourself to feel that pain for a set amount of time, or just until you feel ready to kind of move on to the next stage? Until
you've reached the point of acceptance, until you can say, well, this has happened and it hurts and it's difficult. And it's right that I feel this way. Then you move on. Now, Madeline Black, who was gang raped at the age of 14, she said it's really important not to stay there too long. So you stay there until you're at the point where you can validate, you know what the pain is, you're able to put names to the emotions that you're feeling, you accept that those emotions are there, but then very quickly you've got to move on to, okay, what things are now within my control, what things are now within my influence, and then start to take one action that moves you out of simply surviving towards resilience and ultimately to thriving.
And that was something really striking about one of the other women in your book. So I think it was someone who'd previously had a drug addiction and had hit rock bottom, excuse me. And she said, your wounds are not your fault, but your healing is your responsibility.
Yeah, so Lee Davidson, incredible woman. I mean, I could say incredible woman, incredible man about any one of the 50 thrivers. So, I feel like they're all in my heart, if I'm honest, because they've made such an impact in my life. But Lee Davidson, imagine this, you're born to a father who is a drug dealer, a mother and father who are drug addicts. You've got two little brothers. But, by the time you're 6, you've seen a man's head smashed against a wall. You've seen your father rape your mother and try and murder her with a telephone cable around her neck. And then by the time you're 12, your father starts to sexually abuse you. It was just a litany of one thing after another. And she was removed. One relative, she still doesn't know who, made an anonymous call to social services, and she was removed from home at 12. And then at 14 and a half, her mother said, I'm well now, I'll take her back. And that night let her father in. So she ran away from home. But, even homeless, she's got her school books out on the beach. She lived on the beach in Ayrshire. Homeless, she got her school books out. She's studying for her Highers. And finally, she gets a foster family at the age of 16 and a half, 17, who treat her with love for the first time. So, a really horrific story. And yet, here's this woman who will say, your wounds are your responsibility. It's your responsibility to thrive through that. You can't, your past happens to you, but there comes a point where you've got to accept that and move on. And her insights into the importance of self-love, of self-acceptance, of self-kindness that I write about in chapter 1, they are so powerful. And, there was no one teaching her anything. She just learned that when she walked in nature, she felt calm. So that's how she learned mindfulness. She just learned that when she read books, they took her to a different place where she felt safe. She learned about crafting. Now she's got 4 kids. She works in social services with a mission to close the net on every child who is abandoned emotionally, physically, mentally by their family. You know, I mean, these are just in some ways very ordinary people who have faced maybe pain, trauma, which is greater than some of us, but they ultimately show the resourcefulness, the resilience of the human spirit. And that is something I know for sure we're all capable of.
And my favorite section was the one about seeking your own approval rather than someone else's. I think this is something everyone can relate to, sort of wanting people to like you. How do you break out of those habits and start listening to your own inner voice?
Okay, so yeah, the approval trap. We've all been stuck in the approval trap at one point in our lives. I'm thinking, give me a nod if you recognize that. You know, that whole need for external approval and putting external approval above and beyond your own approval. And really the shift to being authentic, the shift to thriving comes from your own approval mattering more than anyone else's. And so, you know, every one of the thrivers recognized this. So I could pull almost every single story and say, here's the part of their story that really showed that. You know, Tina McGuff, for example, who had anorexia from the age of 12 right the way through to 21, really struggled with being stuck in the approval trap, as she described it, and bust out of it by realizing that her own approval was more important than anyone else's approval. And there are stages that I talk about in the book to shift towards gaining your own approval. So, you know, understanding that you're in the trap in the first place is the first point. You know, Jackie Jones, who had a really violent father who really imposed that whole sense of her not being good enough on her. She talked about the approval trap as well. And there are many. I've only spoken about women. Of course, there are many men. Kenyatta Leal, really incredible guy, was imprisoned for life at the age of 25 under the California 3-strike rule. And he was caught in that approval trap. That's why he ended up in prison, because he was in that gang culture, which is just approval trap by another name. And he bust out of that. And the way that he did that was by being really clear about, you know, what are the things I most value in life, and consciously living every day, focusing on each one of those values. And that caused him to turn inward for approval rather than look outward for approval. So that was life-changing for him, and his story is incredibly moving.
And there was a lot in the book about developing cheerleaders for yourself. So
yeah.
having this posse of people that even when things are going well, you can turn to, as well as during times of adversity. How do you kind of select those people?
Yeah, so chapter 2 is all about support and connection, and every one of the thrivers said it's really, really important that you've got a tribe, and that you know who your tribe are, that they're not just incidentally picked up, but that you've got people there. And I always argue for not just cheerleaders, but challengers too, because you do need people in that tribe who'll go, hang on, Emma, you've got this wrong. You know, you're in the victim narrative again. You need to give yourself a shake and move out of that. But as Jim Rohn said, we're the sum total of the 5 people that we hang around with. And this is about being really conscious about who fills you up. You know, who's really got your back, who really wants the best for you. And if you, I mean, you know, lockdowns maybe given us an unofficial method to edit our friendship group. So we're in contact less with those who we feel less good after a call with, and in contact more with those that we feel great. So it's really, I mean, for me, it starts with values. Who are the people in my friendship group and my family group who really share my core values, and knowing what your 3 or 5 core values are absolutely vital. So that's, but it's also, I've got people in my cheerleader and challenger groups who see the world differently from me, very, very deliberately. So shared values is important, but I want people to challenge me, rather than just exist in an echo chamber. But the other part of having a tribe is people who can validate how you feel. So people who've actually been through something similar to you. So, for example, you know, a couple of coaching clients I have at the moment, I've got a woman whose partner committed suicide, and she doesn't want to go to a self-help group with other people whose partners committed suicide. So, but she's happy to talk to friends of hers who've suffered the loss of a loved one in some way. So it doesn't have to be a replica of what you've been through, but somebody who can actually validate the pain that you're suffering is very, very important, as long as they are not stuck in the victim narrative, because they'll just pull you in with them. So they've got to, you know, have that inner strength and be, you know, sort of in that assertive mode, that driving themselves towards thriving. So that select, you know, 4 or 5 people in your tribe, very carefully selected, tell them who they are, and also make sure in between your own ears, you have your inner cheerleader, your inner mentor, your inner coach, whatever it is you want to call him or her, but make sure that that's in here as well, because that person is hanging out with you all day long. And the thrivers talk about that in the book as well.
Yeah, what were their tips on that? First of all, how do you kind of start listening to your own voice and recognize if it's critical, and then kind of change that self-talk?
So Eric Hodgson talks a lot about that. His 15-year-old daughter Zoe committed suicide, and for, you know, up to a year after her death, he was still blaming himself that he should have seen the signs and so on. And he actually noticed that at certain times in the day, for him, it was getting in the car from the train station to drive home. So at certain parts of the day, he was going through the same emotional experience, and he realized that's because he was berating himself for, you know, not noticing that Zoe needed help. And he caught himself one day, because he always just felt, so some people are very attuned to their thinking, some people are much more attuned to their emotions. So if you're feeling low, there's a good chance that your inner critic's having a field day in your head. So that's a good time to turn inwards and think, what was I just thinking here? What was I just saying to myself? And that's what he did. And his first step toward building that sort of inner coach, that inner cheerleader, was to start deliberately talking compassionately to himself. So literally, he'd be driving home, and what he did was he imagined Zoe was in the passenger seat next to him and saying, you know, Zoe, this is what I'm thinking, and imagining what would she say to him in response. And of course, she was very loving, very compassionate, and she would say, Dad, it's not your fault, you know, you've been a wonderful dad, and so on and so forth. And, you know, so it's a tip that we've heard many times, certainly I had, whether it completely landed with me or not, it certainly has now, that this idea of talking to yourself like you love you know, like a really good friend would talk to you, and starting with compassion is a really powerful place to start. Just giving yourself the benefit of the doubt, understanding your struggles, talk to yourself like you would your own best friend.
Yeah, this is really inspiring me to sort of act with more compassion to both myself and to other people. So it's quite a skill you have to keep practicing it, right? So as soon as your colleague sends you that email, you might go back into your old habits and snap.
Well, I think it was the Dalai Lama said, if you want to be happy, practice compassion. If you want other people to be happy, practice compassion. You know, I mean, there's just one strong language if we want to be at peace, and it's compassion. And every single one of the thrivers talked to me about that too.
One of the other things that really resonated me was this idea of working your acceptance muscle. So kind of accepting what you can actually control and then letting go of what you can't. But I wondered if you thought that, you know, that ever led to a sort of complacency where people think, oh, you know, me giving up meat's not going to stop climate change, so why should I bother? Or, you know, how do you decide what's actually in your control?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, Mary. So if I can bring another story in, because it's the stories that really bring these things to life. Joseph of Belcast, you know, 24 years old, he's Dutch. His father was Moroccan, he's bilingual, he sets up this IT company, and he goes off to Morocco to work for a Dutch company over there as an IT consultant. And one day he turns up at work, and there are gun-wielding customs officers in the car park, literally rounding up civilians. And he goes over to one of them and says, what the hell's going on? And he's frog marched over to one of 3 white transit vans parked in the yard. The doors are flung open and packed very tightly in the back of this transit van with 8,000 kilograms of drugs, you know, tight brown packages. And within 2 hours, he's in a police trial. You know, within 2 weeks, his case is coming up to court, and he's on the phone to his mum, thousands of miles away back at home, saying, they're charging me with illegally importing these drugs. And he said, even at that point, this is all a misunderstanding, you know, it's going to come all right in the end. But long story short, he gets sentenced to 10 years in a Moroccan prison for a crime he didn't commit at the age of 24. And he said at the time when his appeal outcome came, so the commander of the prison came along to him and said, you know, your appeal outcome has been ultimately unsuccessful. He said, in that moment, Emma, I realized I had a choice, that even though I was going to get locked up in these horrific conditions, filthy, filthy conditions for the next 10 years of my life for something I hadn't done, I still could choose to thrive. And he said that choosing to thrive, first of all, was accepting his situation that he was in, but then focusing very carefully on how he would manage his thinking. So he noticed that his mind wanted to go to the injustice of the situation, to all of the things he could no longer control or influence. And he said he got really good at focusing on what he could control and what he could influence, and only focusing his thinking on that. So Dr. Amy Johnson talks about these thinking buses that go round in our heads, 60 to 70,000 of them a day. And, we spend, according to research, 90% of the thoughts you have today will be the same as the thoughts you had yesterday. And 65% of your thoughts are negative or redundant. So most of us are wheeling around on buses about stuff we can't change from the past, things that may or may not happen in the future. And that's most of our thinking. And Joseph got really good at being very mindful about what he's thinking and focusing his thinking on what he could control or influence. And when I talk about that story, some people say, well, hang on a minute, surely that means you wouldn't change things. I said, it means the opposite. Because it means you're not wasting your thinking on the other stuff. It actually means that you're thinking about, what action can I take that would control this situation? What action can I take that might influence this situation? So I'm going to sign that petition. I'm going to go out on that march. I'm going to have that conversation. And you're not wasting any of your mental energy on the things that you can't control or influence, which is the space most of us occupy mentally every day. And he said that was one of the things that really got him through, because it pushed him to do things like learn Arabic phonetically, so he made friends in the prison, asked to work in the prison shop so that he had a purpose every day, persuade the guards to plant a garden in the prison grounds, persuade the guards to let them have a gym so that he and the prisoners. So he said it pushed him to take action and create plans that he never would have done if he hadn't channeled his thinking in that direction. And so acceptance is actually the opposite. And Paul Smith, who had God bless him, Paul, I've just forgotten the name of the condition. It will come back to me in a moment, but he was terminally ill. And he was a boxer. He'd always been incredibly fit. And initially he was fighting against his diagnosis. And he said the change occurred when he accepted that he had this diagnosis, that he would motor neuron disease, and he had the tough kind of motor neuron disease. So it was very aggressive. So literally month by month, he was losing the ability to swallow, to move his hands, and so on. It was at the point where he accepted that he had the condition and the impact it would have in his life, where everything changed for the better. Because he then thought, okay, I understand the limitations, so that now helps me focus on the things I can do, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So actually acceptance really is the portal through which we can start to live a much more meaningful and powerful life, even in those difficult circumstances.
Mm. And that was another really powerful lesson of your book, wasn't it? To kind of try and think about what you value and then live your life, with this meaning which you decide on. How do people, how on earth does anyone decide what their kind of life calling is?
Oh, wow. So there's a whole chapter on purpose and meaning, and some incredibly inspiring stories. And so I used to believe that purpose was different for all of us, and it's this esoteric idea that hopefully one day we will wake up and discover, but many of us will die not knowing, which is a really depressing thought. What I now believe to be true, having met all of these thrivers, is that in fact, purpose is fundamentally the same for all of us. It's using our skills and our experience and our attributes to make a positive difference in the lives of others, to make a positive contribution in the lives of others. So in fact, you can live out your purpose buying a coffee, or you could live out your purpose. Now, that's not to say you're fully living out your purpose, because I think that once you become very clear about what purpose is, as I've described it, you move, you think much more deeply about what are my strengths, what are my skills, what are my attributes, what are my natural interests, what are my intrinsic motivations, what are they, and how can I bring those to bear to make a positive difference in the lives of others. And the more refined that becomes, that's where you really connect with the purpose, that's what really gives your life meaning. And every single one of the thrivers I spoke to described that same journey, because you can't thrive without purpose. But we can all find it. We could all begin that journey towards finding our purpose tonight by just working through those aspects and moving in iterative steps closer and closer and closer towards it. So even if you're in a job that you don't like, tomorrow you can start working more purposefully, and suddenly it becomes more joyful.
And that is a kind of exercise in thinking, you know, what am I good at, or what difference do I want to make, and then kind of making small movements to live more consciously.
Yeah, I mean, I in the sort of 1 to 4 steps, you know, it's knowing what your 5 core values are. It's knowing what your 3 or 4 intrinsic motivators are. It's being really clear about what your 3 or 4 strengths are, and it's being really clear about what your natural area of interest are. And once you literally map all of that out, you can start to see a very clear cross section where all of these components interlink, and that's the sweet spot. Because the one thing common is you take that and you apply it to make a positive difference in the lives of others, or to make your unique contribution. And that's the bit, that's where the rubber hits the road. But without that focus, you're not, well, I should say with that focus, you start to move very deliberately closer to a much more meaningful life.
Mm-hmm. And I was speaking to an academic today that works with sex workers, and he said when someone's kind of come out of that work, or they've kicked an addiction or started a program, we give them lots of praise and support, and they're sort of seen as this, you know, rags to riches, or someone who's overcome resilience. But there's less of the focus on the people who are still in that stage where they're doing work that they hate, or they have a drug addiction, and they're the people that are lonely and need our support. So what's your kind of response to that? What do you think we should do about the people that aren't thriving and haven't kind of taken the steps to start that journey?
Go and support them. So one of the core beliefs I have is that people can only change if they want to change and they believe change is possible. So I say that from a point of view about a brother I had a brother, he was a drug addict, and ultimately he's no longer with us. And unfortunately, he never reached the point where he really, really wanted to change or believed change was possible. And I mean, my truth is that unless you're there, now what we then look at is, well, how can we support people to believe that change is possible? That's why the book is written with these stories. Because when you hear inspiring stories like this, then those people who feel stuck and feel it can never happen to them are suddenly inspired by individuals whose trauma or adversity or addiction was much worse than perhaps where they are. So that's why I wrote a book with those inspiring stories in it, because I think we need to help people see that change is possible. But whether someone wants to change is down to the individual, because it all depends on whether the pain of being where they are is greater than the difficulty of moving out of where they are. You know, so there comes a tipping point. And for some people, that tipping point never arrives. But for others, it does. But I think, you know, if we can work with people in the area of change is possible, because I do believe change is possible for everyone, but they do need to want to change. And, you know, you can put supports in place, like having mentors, having accountability partners, helping them understand about how habits are formed and how habits are broken, and all that education piece. But fundamentally, it needs to come from here. And that's what every one of the thrivers in their various difficulties, they really wanted. They wanted to move out of simply that surviving state, which is where many of us exist.
And what kind of impact has your book and your work had? Do you hear from the thrivers still today?
Yeah, so I hear from the thrivers, and I hear about how the book is pushing interest in their direction, which is brilliant. But I think, one of the qualifiers to have the thrivers involved in the project was that their values had to be the same as the values of the project. So the Global Resilience Project, as it then was all about making a positive difference in the lives of others. So that our contributing thrivers were all driven by those values. And so actually what the thrivers are really happy about is when I share emails like one I got this morning that I've got in front of me, when I share feedback that I get from workshops or webinars where people say that webinar changed my life, that story changed my life, the book changed my life. And so I love to share those with the thrivers, because ultimately that's why they gave up their precious time to meet with me wherever they were in the world to share their story. And I've got, can I read this one?
Yes, please.
If people don't mind, I got this email this morning. And this email says, Emma, I just wanted to let you know about the impact that your talk has made. So I gave a webinar a week or two ago. My husband was diagnosed with advanced cancer during the first lockdown. And if I'm honest, life has been somewhat grim since the moment of diagnosis. I am a person who gets on with things and copes, but finding that our time is limited really threw me. Listening to the narratives of how people had coped with great tragedy and yet found the strength and courage to carry on was really humbling. I decided that afternoon that I would not allow the time we have left together to be spoiled by the circumstances we find ourselves in, and I'm working every day to choose a narrative, see what is possible, and to avoid complaining. Effectively, what you said has changed our lives for the better, and I cannot thank you enough. Now that's what the thrivers do, and that's why the thrivers shared their stories, because they really want the ripple effect of their joint wisdom and their joint inspiration to go far and wide.
And just a couple more questions before I'll open it up to the audience. But I found it absolutely hilarious in the book where you described how you let your mother design your wedding dress. So I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about that dress and your bridesmaids' dresses.
Oh, yeah. So this was in the context of the victim narrative. And so my first marriage, I'm now very happily married, but first marriage that career towards a really difficult divorce. My mum wanted us to get married in the town that she lived in, but we were paying for the wedding and we wanted to get married in the place where most people would be traveling from. And so that meant that my mum stopped speaking to me the minute we told her that. So in an effort to try and cajole her to become involved in the wedding, I said, what would it take? And she said, I know what it would take. Let me design your wedding dresses and the bridesmaids' dresses. And in a moment of weakness, I said yes. Oh my God, never, ever let anyone design a dress for you that's clearly got different taste, because I ended up looking like an extra from Pride and Prejudice. Now, I was getting married in a Catholic church, and this scoop at the front barely covered my nipples, so that when I leaned over to sign the witness thing, I was nearly, I'm not that well endowed, but whatever little was there was about to tip out. And my then husband's uncle was the Monsignor who was conducting the ceremony, and his eyes nearly dropped on the table. And then my witnesses, my bridesmaids, I should say, my mum had chosen for some reason a really washed out lemon colour of chiffon to dress my sister and my husband's cousin, and they looked awful. And there was, you couldn't even have told them they looked beautiful. So I just looked in the mirror and thought, my God, that's one ugly bride. I'm surprised Simon married me. In fact, maybe she could have done me a favour. He's a lovely, lovely man. It just was never meant to be. So yeah. And rather than actually deal with the issue, which is, look, we can't pull out about this. Let's talk about the issue. Because I wasn't brave enough to deal with that and set my boundaries and ask for what I needed, and instead let her design the whole wedding dress stuff, it was a disaster. So always go with the needs and boundaries. Don't compromise on that.
A very cautionary tale. So we've just got a question from the audience from Orna. Do you think social media is an enemy of resilience building? Matt Haig, who's an author who's written about depression, has had to come off Twitter because of trolls and hate comments. He was a great help to people with positive and wise advice.
Yeah. So I think social media is something that you have to take responsibility for using in a way that works for you. And, you know, set boundaries around the use of social media. So, for example, I noticed that I never feel better when I come off Facebook than I felt before I went on it, because it's a place where people compare their outsides with, you know, you compare your insides with everyone else's outside. So my view is it's just not a place I want to spend any time, because it reduces my resilience. So just notice, but then that said, I like Twitter. Twitter is okay for me. But so just notice what the effect of social media is on your state and take control, because that is absolutely something you can control and influence in terms of the degree to which you use it. Can't control what people say about you, and that takes us into a whole other arena I'm really worried about, which is young people and social media and the impact on them, and the project, in fact, that I'm involved in is bringing resilience into mainstream education within the next 5 years in Scotland and more broadly in the UK, because I think young people need to understand that thriving is within their control, and social media definitely forms a part of that.
Yeah, I've always been incredibly grateful that I'm slightly too old to have grown up with Facebook and TikTok. And that I just think the pressure on young women and young men to kind of look very beautiful or to always be very funny or to, you know, it's almost like you're performing your whole life, isn't it? Which can't always be healthy.
We've just had a recent study, haven't we, on the impact on female mental health and mental health of young women, which is not surprising, of social media. 45%, is that right, of young women between the age of 13 and 17 suffering from depression, largely caused or significantly caused by social media. I mean, it's awful.
It's terrible. And I think Thessie has a question. If we could unmute Shirin.
Hi, yeah, just before I ask my question, to follow up from that, I remember with social media, what it was if I was already going through a depression and the social media trolls, it would just make it worse. Do you know what I mean? So instead of bouncing back from a bad day, it would be like, it just makes it even worse. So I totally agree with the social media stuff. So my question is this, maybe because personally I have an issue with it sometimes, the revenge, not so much the sadness, but the revenge thoughts, especially if a trauma or something came from a person or a group of people. Did you ever meet some of these people where it was like, they did admit they still had it, but it was okay, or they put it into something useful?
Yeah, so one of the 9 secrets to thriving is about forgiveness. But that doesn't mean that you have to get to the point of forgiving. And then that's the thing that I learned. So you can thrive even though you haven't forgiven, as long as you've reflected in certain ways without giving too many of the insights away. So the whole forgiveness chapter, actually, Stacey, I found the forgiveness chapter the hardest one to write. I had to really work through a lot of my own stuff in writing that. It was really, really hard. But what it gave me was just this understanding that holding on to those vengeful thoughts was only affecting one person. Guess who that was? And it gave me some practical ways to start to release those. And so with some people, you're able to go as far as forgiving them, but with others, you're simply able to release the vengeful thoughts to using certain approaches that the thrivers talk about in that chapter. So I suppose in some ways the good news is you can thrive without going through full forgiveness. Okay. But the bad news is that you can only thrive if you start on that journey and you start reflecting and really working on how to let go of the vengeful thought.
Thank you.
I hope that's helpful.
And I think we've got another, Edwina, did you want to ask a question? No, oh, sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. I wanted to ask about whether you always intended the book to be an audiobook, or whether you kind of wrote it first and then thought that because you had these human stories, it would suit.
Well, it was interesting. The honest answer is no. I'd always intended it to be a traditional book, and we got an offer. We got offers from traditional publishers, but we also got an offer from Audible. And it was when Audible shared their vision for the book, because they were saying, we want not just your voice on the book, we want the thrivers' voices on the book. That really caught my imagination. And I remember the day of the interview being in London with the Audible team, and then being so excited about how this book was going to come to life. And that really caught my imagination, and that made me decide to go with Audible, to go with the deal that I had with Audible rather than the traditional publishing deal. Now, the book will come out in a traditional form ultimately, but I would have missed the opportunity to hear the book. And they've done such an amazing job on production. It's just brilliant. And I think you were saying, Madlen, that perhaps before we came on, that actually hearing the thriver voices just brings it to life. It's really incredible. I love it.
It completely brings it to life. Not only do you hear kind of your passion, but you hear the thrivers in their own voices, which I think is quite rare. You know, I work in journalism, and you're always hearing people's voices mediated through the journalist or through someone else. So just that kind of raw passion was amazing to hear. We've got another question. Does denial sometimes look like resilience to the outside world? Well, that's very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I guess it depends who in the outside world is looking at it. Because actually, if you understand what resilience is and what thriving is, you would see right through denial. Because, you know, you don't have to scratch denial very hard to get to the sort of stubbornness, the belligerence, and often the anger that still exists underneath that. So you can hear it in the intonation. But it might do to the uninformed observer, to someone who's either A, isn't that interested in the person who's in the denial state, but certainly I can pick it up very with coaching clients. You know, you can hear denial. You know, it's fine, it's all okay. You know, I'm over it. Absolutely great. I'm fantastic. You know, think, oh right, okay, that's the third time we've used the word fantastic inside 2 minutes. Let's explore that.
Is that just a kind of normal coping mechanism for people? So if they, you know, say they're okay, they hope that eventually the sort of inside will match.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a coping mechanism for many people, for sure. Not for everyone, though. Not for everyone. I mean, that's one other thing. We need to understand that our journeys are very individual. You know, stuff happens, large or small, and we will react in a very unique way to that. And I think you do need to be careful about generalizing with you know, I've mentioned the grief curve already. You need to be quite careful in saying, well, there are 6 steps through and you've missed step number 4. So you can't, you know, it's very individual, which is why I wrote the book in the way that I did. Because actually, depending on where you are, you won't start at resilience strategy number 1 and work through all 9. There are some times in your life where you'll think, actually, what I really need is gratitude here, or what I really need is self-care, or what I really need right now is to reflect on how authentic I'm being, or what I really need right now. And, you know, so many people have said to me, I really want the book when it comes out in hard copy too, because it's like a handbook. But even with the audiobook, they'll have tabbed certain points, and, you know, they might wake up on a wet Wednesday and think, I'm feeling really demotivated today, really down, and I'm stuck in the cycle of thinking, and they'll think, you know, what would help? And they'll know immediately where to go to. So it's a different thing for every day, not a linear process.
And we've got a question from Jean Smith. As a social anthropologist, she's curious about the methodologies you used in your research.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. The way that we approached that, I had a very very competent psychologist who's a specialist in resilience on the project with me. So we went through the process of, now there may be a term for this which Paul could tell you, but we went through the process of having very clearly defined terms, of testing every potential candidate against each of those defined terms, and then of doing pre-qualifying interviews, and then doing interviews, pre-interviews, and then going and traveling to see the people. So there may be a name for that process. Is it Jean who's asked the question? I can't see the name. Yes, Jean. There may be a name for that process, Jean, that I don't know, but that was the process that I was coached through in order to test research. And obviously when I was going out to meet the people, making sure that I was asking open questions, guarding against confirmation bias, and all of those kinds of things, and having the standard questions and so on. Is there a name for that approach, Jean? I'm curious. Oh, you're on mute. Shireen, can we unmute Jean? Because I'm going to learn something here.
Well, that technique is interviewing. I was curious which, like you said, you used the help of a psychologist?
Yeah.
So like in social anthropology, we would have different methodologies, and then we would triangulate, because sometimes what people say, but no, that sounds really good. Yeah.
Okay, I thought there was maybe a name for it that I could steal from you and then use it next time just to look really super impressive.
How about interviewing technique?
Interviewing technique, we'll take that. That's great, that's great. But know that Paul, our psychologist on the team, so we had a team of about 5 or 6, so I was really just the momentum behind it, because I really wanted to know the answer, and the interviewer researcher, but I have incredibly capable people on the team, because the question I haven't had yet that I expected to have was, how did you find these 50 people? And, you know, I think we had about 150 initially pre-qualifying, and we tested them against each of the defined terms, and so many of them didn't qualify. And then we had a smaller number, we went into pre-interview, and then other people fell away. But let me tell you, it was a long and arduous journey. Thank you for that question, Jean.
And in fact, somebody's asked, did you need to draw on your own inner resilience to be an author? And did you worry about the reactions to your book?
No, it's so interesting. So this is my second book. And when I wrote my first book, honestly, there was a lot more anxiety attached to it. I can honestly say with this book, there was no anxiety whatsoever. And I think there were probably 2 or 3 reasons for that. Number one, my role on this book was always about being the researcher. It was always about pulling together the research, sharing the outcomes, and telling people's stories. I do talk about my own life in some way. But the second is, I'm sure that this whole process really nailed the approval trap stuff for me, because actually I can honestly say that I'm no longer caught in the approval trap. It was all about, am I doing this for the right reasons? Am I writing and relaying these stories with integrity? Have I done all the checking in with them to make sure that I'm being honest and faithful to their story? And as long as I was doing right by them and coming from the right place, then I was just prepared to let it go. And I'm sure that's because going through this 3-year research journey just changed me. You know, and if it gets a bad review, it gets a bad review. That's okay. It's not about me. It's about the work, and the work won't work for everyone, and that's okay.
Yeah, such a good manifestation of it working. That's what thriving is, of not being reactive to these opinions. And just one last question. So what tips do you have about setting boundaries with those difficult people in your life without falling out with them?
Yeah, so the first thing is doing the inner work and knowing what your own tendencies are and what your own triggers are. So for those of you who know about parent, adult, child, Eric Byrne's transactional analysis stuff, and the drama triangle, so are you a rescuer by default, are you a persecutor by default, or a victim by default? I think the starting point is knowing what are your tendencies and how do they get triggered or played out in certain relationships, and then set boundaries for yourself first. So what causes me to be triggered, and what boundaries do I need to set in order to minimize the risk of being triggered? So for starters, I need to make sure that I'm not hungry, angry, lonely, tired, or feeling unloved, so that I feel resourceful. Number 2, I'm not going to meet them in person, not very possible right now. I'm only going to have a call with them, or have a call with them less frequently. If it's not going, so it's only once you really understand your own tendencies and your own triggers that you set boundaries and rules for yourself. And then you learn the language of expressing your needs. And, you know, I would say there are kind of 4 or 5 key codes to the language, you know, using open questions, using active speaking. So really owning, you know, I noticed this and I imagine that and I feel that, rather than putting the blame on someone else. Because fundamentally, We are each responsible for our own happiness and no one else is. And you're not responsible for anyone else's happiness either. And I write about that in the book. And once you really get that, you get so much better at knowing that the work in thriving in relationships comes from the inside. You do that inner work and suddenly there's a lot less heavy lifting. And I say that from bitter experience, let me tell you. I'm not going to share here, but you know, having navigated through some tough family stuff.
Well, thank you so much, Emma. We're going to have to end it now. But that was so inspiring. I really want to go back through every point in the book and really kind of in the next couple of months try and really put it into practice. And definitely all the stories that you've shared, they really moved me. And I almost feel a sort of sense of inadequacy that all of these people have gone through these sort of terrible and traumatic things and yet are thriving. And, you know, I guess in the pandemic, it's difficult sometimes, isn't it, to not to be upset that it's dark or that you can't go to a park in the summer. But as you've shown, you know, we could all thrive and we just need to learn the skills and hone those skills so we use them all the time. So the next book club is on 3rd of March. So details will be coming if you follow the Groucho Club's newsletter. But thank you all for coming. And again, I say this every time, but one day we'll all be able to meet in the Groucho for a cocktail. So I look forward to that day.
Me too. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Maddie.